Modern dating has started to resemble something strangely ancient, not romance, not partnership, worship. More and more people no longer approach each other as ordinary human beings trying to build connection. Instead, they approach dating like a ritual of sacrifice. One person offers time, money, attention, validation, emotional energy, luxury experiences, and endless effort, hoping that eventually they will be rewarded with affection, intimacy, exclusivity, or love. And at the center of this ritual often stands what modern culture quietly created, the female idol. Not simply a woman, an idol. A figure elevated above ordinary humanity and transformed into fantasy, status, validation, and emotional aspiration. Someone desired not only for who she is, but for what she symbolically represents. Once that transformation happens, dating changes psychologically because people do not interact with idols honestly. They impress them, perform for them, sacrifice for them, and hope their offering will finally be enough. That is why so many modern relationships feel emotionally exhausting before they even begin. People are no longer trying to know each other naturally. They are trying to prove value through performance while hiding their own vulnerability underneath carefully managed images. And the moment attraction becomes worship instead of mutual discovery, corruption quietly enters the process. The psychology of idol worship has always depended on one powerful illusion. If I sacrifice enough, maybe I will finally receive what I desire. That is exactly why this dynamic quietly mirrors modern dating culture so well. Historically, people offered sacrifices to idols hoping for blessings in return. Money, food, animals, devotion, rituals, all given in hopes that the higher being would eventually reward them with protection, abundance, love, or salvation. But there was never a guaranteed exchange. The worshiper could only give and hope. And modern dating increasingly functions the same way. Many men enter the dating process already understanding that direct transaction feels socially unacceptable. Genuine attraction is supposed to appear spontaneous, emotional, organic. So instead of openly negotiating desire, many men symbolically communicate value through sacrifice, expensive dinners, luxury experiences, constant attention, thoughtful gifts, emotional availability, endless effort, and underneath all of it lives one hidden psychological message. You are valuable enough for me to sacrifice for. At first, this may sound romantic, but psychologically, something much deeper is happening. The man is trying to elevate the woman above ordinary transactional reality. He is trying to separate her psychologically from anything that resembles direct exchange, because most women do not want to feel purchased, and most men instinctively understand this. So the ritual becomes indirect, symbolic, emotional, a performance of admiration designed to preserve the fantasy that attraction exists outside economics and power dynamics, even while both people quietly feel those dynamics underneath every interaction. That is why many women react strongly to low-effort dates. A coffee date is rarely interpreted literally as just coffee. Emotionally, it becomes symbolic. It communicates perceived value. If this is all he offers, then this is all he thinks I'm worth. This is where modern dating slowly stops functioning as mutual exploration and starts functioning as symbolic negotiation. People begin measuring each other through effort, status, exclusivity, aesthetics, and sacrifice, rather than emotional compatibility itself. And social media intensified this dramatically because now beauty no longer exists only within private life. It exists publicly, continuously, and competitively. Attention became visible, quantifiable, addictive. Followers, likes, admiration, luxury invitations, direct messages, expensive gifts, all of it slowly transforms validation to emotional currency. And emotional currency changes human behavior. A woman who constantly receives elevated treatment can slowly begin expecting worship instead of reciprocity. not necessarily because she is malicious, but because human beings adapt psychologically to the environments rewarding them, the same way people adapt to wealth, status, or fame. Eventually, extraordinary treatment starts feeling normal, expected, deserved. That is why modern dating increasingly contains invisible emotional hierarchies. One person becomes the prize, the other becomes the pursuer. One evaluates while the other performs. One receives while the other attempts proving sufficient worth. And this creates enormous emotional imbalance from the very beginning, because performance is not intimacy. Performance creates anxiety. The performer constantly fears inadequacy. He worries another man may offer more status, more money, more excitement, more attention. His emotional value becomes tied to continuous output. Meanwhile, the idol experiences a different kind of psychological distortion. Once someone becomes heavily idealized, they stop feeling genuinely seen as a human being. People desire the image, the fantasy, the symbolic meaning attached to them, but rarely the ordinary reality underneath it. That creates hidden loneliness. Being admired is not the same as being understood. And ironically, the more someone becomes idolized, the harder authentic intimacy often becomes, because intimacy requires equality, mutual vulnerability, emotional realism. Worship destroys realism. Once someone is elevated onto a pedestal, ordinary humanity starts feeling disappointing. The worshiper projects perfection, while the idol feels pressure maintaining the illusion. Neither person can relax into authenticity because the entire relationship becomes organized around fantasy management. This is why so many modern dating interactions feel emotionally artificial despite appearing glamorous externally. The expensive restaurants, the carefully curated photos, the luxurious experiences, the performative romance. Everything looks emotionally impressive from the outside, while internally both individuals often feel strangely disconnected. Because they are not truly relating to each other, they are relating to symbolic roles: the provider, the desired woman, the high-status man, the unattainable beauty, the emotionally valuable prize. And when people become roles instead of human beings, relationships slowly lose emotional sincerity. This is where corruption enters. Not because attraction itself is wrong, not because beauty itself is wrong, but because incentives begin replacing authenticity. Once emotional connection becomes mixed with status display, financial signaling, validation, economies, and social leverage, people stop behaving naturally. They begin behaving strategically. The man calculates how much effort creates attraction. The woman calculates how much attention confirms value. And slowly, both become trapped inside invisible negotiations neither fully acknowledges openly. That is why modern dating often feels exhausting before commitment even exists. People are not simply trying to connect anymore. They are trying to maintain perceived value within a psychological marketplace where everyone fears becoming emotionally disposable. The deeper problem with this system is that once dating becomes organized around sacrifice and validation, people slowly lose sight of what relationships were originally supposed to accomplish. Dating was never meant to be theater. It was supposed to be discovery, two people learning whether trust, attraction, emotional safety, compatibility, and shared values genuinely exist between them. But once performance becomes central, authenticity quietly disappears because both people become incentivized to manipulate perception instead of revealing reality. The man performs confidence, abundance, emotional composure, and status. The woman performs desirability, exclusivity, beauty, and emotional reward, and both carefully protect the image they believe the other person wants to see. That is why so many modern relationships begin with intensity but collapse under reality. The connection was never fully built on truth in the first place. It was built on projections, fantasy, and symbolic roles. One person falls in love with validation, the other falls in love with admiration. but eventually, real human limitations appear. And fantasy does not survive reality easily. This is especially true in the age of social media, where people are constantly exposed to idealized alternatives. Modern dating no longer happens privately between two individuals. It happens inside a massive digital marketplace where beauty, status, wealth, and attention are endlessly displayed and compared. This changes attraction psychologically. A man no longer compares a woman only to women in his real environment. He compares her to curated fantasies online. Likewise, many women no longer compare potential partners to ordinary men around them. They compare them to visible lifestyles, status symbols, and emotionally stimulating experiences constantly displayed across social media. The result is subtle emotional dissatisfaction. Ordinary reality starts feeling insufficient compared to fantasy. And fantasy is incredibly difficult to compete against because fantasy contains no friction, no boredom, no ordinary vulnerability, no emotional inconvenience. Fantasy always appears emotionally cleaner, more exciting, more beautiful, more rewarding than real human connection. That is why people increasingly consume attraction instead of building intimacy. They chase emotional stimulation rather than emotional depth. And stimulation addiction creates instability because stimulation always fades. This is one reason modern dating often feels emotionally disposable. Once people become accustomed to constant novelty and validation, relationships start functioning more like entertainment experiences than emotional commitments. People become replaceable. Attention becomes temporary. Connection becomes conditional on continued excitement, beauty, performance, or status. And underneath all of this lives tremendous anxiety. Men fear becoming financially or emotionally insufficient. Women fear becoming invisible, replaceable, or less desired. Both become trapped in endless self-optimization, trying to maintain value within a system increasingly organized around perception. That pressure slowly damages emotional trust between men and women. Because once relationships become transactional psychologically, both sides start interpreting affection strategically. Generosity becomes suspicious, kindness feels calculated, attention feels conditional, desire feels tied to utility instead of genuine care. And this creates modern cynicism. People no longer approach dating openly, they approach defensively. Men fear being used, women fear being manipulated. Both fear emotional exploitation. So instead of vulnerability, people increasingly rely on strategy. They test each other, withhold emotionally, perform detachment, protect leverage, avoid appearing too interested, pretend abundance, pretend indifference. Everyone becomes emotionally guarded while simultaneously craving connection. That contradiction is exhausting. And ironically, the more people operate this way, the more emotionally unreal dating becomes. Individuals begin feeling admired but not known, desired but not understood, chosen but not emotionally safe, because worship and intimacy are fundamentally incompatible. Worship creates distance. Real intimacy requires equality. You cannot deeply connect with someone you secretly see as superior, unattainable, or symbolically valuable beyond ordinary humanity. The moment someone becomes the prize, authentic reciprocity begins collapsing. This damages women too, even when the attention initially feels empowering, because endless admiration often creates emotional isolation rather than fulfillment. People become attached to the image instead of the real person underneath it. The woman feels pressure maintaining desirability while secretly wondering whether anyone genuinely values her beyond beauty, status, or emotional stimulation. That creates loneliness hidden beneath validation. A woman may receive constant attention while still feeling profoundly unseen. Likewise, men trapped in endless performance often begin feeling emotionally exhausted and resentful. They feel they must continuously sacrifice value, confidence, money, emotional labor, and status just to remain emotionally relevant. And over time, resentment replaces admiration. That is why idol dynamics rarely create stable long-term relationships. Eventually, either the worshiper becomes disillusioned or the idol becomes emotionally disconnected from reality itself. Because no human being was designed to permanently carry the psychological weight of projection, fantasy, and symbolic perfection. At some point, reality always returns. And reality demands something modern dating increasingly struggles to provide: mutual humanity. In the end, the corruption of dating begins the moment people stop relating to each other as human beings and start relating to each other as symbols. The female idol is not simply a woman. She becomes fantasy, validation, status, emotional aspiration, and projection. And once someone is elevated into that role, genuine intimacy becomes difficult because worship always creates emotional distance. The worshiper sacrifices, the idol receives, and both slowly lose touch with reality. That is why so many modern relationships feel emotionally exhausting even before commitment begins. People are no longer simply asking, do we genuinely connect? They are asking, how valuable am I in this marketplace of attention? And once attraction becomes organized around performance, status, validation, and symbolic sacrifice, authenticity quietly disappears. Men begin feeling they must constantly prove worth through effort and provision. Women begin feeling admired for image more than understood as people. Both sides become emotionally guarded while secretly craving something real. That is the hidden tragedy underneath modern dating culture. Not that attraction exists, not that beauty has power, but that fantasy increasingly replaced mutual humanity. Because real intimacy was never supposed to feel like worship. It was supposed to feel safe, honest, reciprocal. Two imperfect people gradually discovering whether they can trust each other without performance, manipulation, or emotional theater. And perhaps that is why so many people feel lonely despite endless attention. They are being desired constantly, but rarely truly seen,